This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai irarangi te motu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash, difficult art, and our complicated relationships with art and culture. My name's Hugh, I'm the host of the show, and I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a very mild content warning for the show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good, but sometimes there are aspects of the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Check the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment. That's right, this is another episode of Reserved Recommendations. This is a radio show and podcast on Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irarangi o ngā Tangata o Manawatu, produced with the support of New Zealand On Air, so cheers for that, guys. Today I am talking to Mira. How's it going?
Yeah, nothing to complain about, really. It's interesting to do this from the other side of the world, both hemisphere-wise and just horizontally-wise, because it's currently evening here, but I'm a night owl anyway, so that's no problem.
Yeah. Trying to work with time zones is always an interesting science, but you're in the Netherlands, which conveniently, at the moment, because we're still on daylight savings time, just puts us 12 hours ahead, which is normally like trying to talk to my brother in the UK. That's feasible. The one that does my head in is when I try and talk to people who are in the States, because they're always like 14 hours or 7.5 hours. And so the maths that you have to do is way more complicated, and it always ends up being antisocial for someone.
Absolutely. This is very doable.
However, the thing we're talking about in particular is not time zones. It is the long and complicated and deranged history and universe of Warhammer. And I guess a little bit of background to kind of set the table on where I'm coming from. I kind of dropped off it because it was like a choice of I could do role-playing or I could be in bands, and I decided I would be in bands. But for a long time, I was a role-playing kid. I did that kind of throughout the end of the original World of Darkness. And so my experience of Warhammer and wargaming generally was that it was like a parallel society or a parallel cast of people that like the Venn diagrams overlapped a bit, but there was also a bit of, I'm assuming that there is a Dutch version of this that you can relate to. You know, the thing where like people might be racist, but who they really hate is the people in the next town over?
Right, yeah.
There was a little bit of that between the role players and the war gamers.
That's in the Netherlands. That would be literally every single other person in the country versus Amsterdam.
Right. Yeah. No, exactly.
Don't mention the Belgians.
We have a similar relationship between everywhere in the country versus Auckland, which is the largest city, and everywhere in the country versus Wellington, which is the capital. And so, exactly that thing. And then everyone gangs up together and hates on Magic the Gathering players because those people are sex criminals.
Nerds, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's funny that you mentioned the role-playing versus tabletop war game aspect, actually, because I'm doing this off memory, so Warhammer fans who are listening, please don't tear me to bits and feed me to the Emperor if I'm wrong in this one, but I'm pretty sure the original Warhammer games kind of grew out of those role-playing games, where they made like a handful of miniatures that you then sent on adventures. And then they start making more miniatures, and it just didn't become feasible to have like a deep backstory and name for like 30-man regiments anymore.
I mean,
there's still quite the overlap.
Is it related to Space Hulk? Because I remember people who were into Hero Quest, which is another kind of thing that sits in the middle between wargaming and role-playing as a board game experience, were also kind of into Space Hulk, and I feel like those are connected.
Yeah, Space Hulk is a game specifically set within Warhammer, specifically Warhammer 40k, which is the You could call it sci-fi. I'd say it's more science fantasy, but that's nerd distinctions anyway. Who cares? Like far, far, far future setting. There's also Warhammer Fantasy, which is how I originally got into it. That's pretty much its own entire separate thing. There's a couple of overlaps which we'll probably get into at some point, but the main focus of tonight was going to be Warhammer 40,000, I think, mainly because this podcast is called Reserved Recommendations, and boy howdy do I have a lot more reservations about recommending 40k than I do fantasy.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess the table setting that I want to do is partly about like what was my understanding of 40k, but also there was like, and this is probably to do as much with my social circles, particularly my like online social circles shifting over time, is that when I was a Vampire the Masquerade player and the Wargamers were, over there doing their thing, there was a Warhammer 40k guy, and like, he was, in fact, in one of my classes at high school. They were like my form class. And, I don't know.
I think I know where this is going.
He was the kind of guy who has some strong feelings on like Claymore anti-tank mines that he wanted to share in detail with you over morning tea. Like, and had some like weird ideas about military service and all of that kind of stuff. I'm sure that with us no longer both being teenagers, he has matured in better directions, but like there was a type. And now, probably because I'm mostly doing my social media on Blue Sky, which is probably the transist social network, mostly who I see talking about Warhammer is trans people or people with trans flags in their bios and pictures, etc. At least, and that shift has been fascinating, just because it means there's like a completely different vibe on the kinds of conversations that I'm seeing going past.
Yeah, definitely. There's a couple of reasons for that. For example, if your favorite, if you were like a kid like 10, 15 years ago, your favorite Gale God was Slanesh. Congratulations, girl, how's the transition going? But also, there's a whole bunch of reasons. Probably there's a lot of themes of transhumanism in 40k, which is deeply ironic, as we'll get into. That partially often tends to appeal to trans people, of course. There's also the fact that it's, at this point, not quite mainstream, not in the way D&D is, but it's widely popular enough to just have wildly different social circles. And like you said, Blue Sky's transist social networks, that definitely helps. And there's, if I'm being honest, probably also the point that there's a bit of an overlap between being trans and being autistic, and also being autistic and being really into Warhammer, because it's a great setting to be autistic about. And I'm saying this as someone who is both trans and autistic, by the way.
I am not diagnosed as anything, but suspect probably there's something in the attention deficit area going on with me, just looking at like how I've been in my life and conversations I've had with people who've been diagnosed. And like, based on conversations with definitely neurospicy people, I can see the appeal of Warhammer. Like, you can really, there's a lot of stuff you can delve into a long way. I wondered actually if there was if another element, and this is perhaps just like a couple of specific people I've seen doing things, but the like miniature cultivation and painting side, because it means that you can do things like decide that I'm going to have a trans flag chapter of Space Marines if you want to. And that's a thing that's like a bit more difficult to do aesthetically in some other places.
Absolutely. There is, speaking of Blue Sky, there is one French person, I forget his name, but he regularly does Pride flag Warhammer mini schemes, which is really cool. But also, I should have known this would happen because Warhammer is just like that, but we're kind of scattering about here and there which makes sense if you know what a Warhammer is and why there are 40,000 of them. But maybe for the listeners that don't know yet, we should probably cover our basics.
We should absolutely do that. So, can you please give us like a potted history of like what is Warhammer and then why is it 40,000?
Yes. So there's two introductions to Warhammer that I like giving people. There is one which is the shitty meme version, and there is the other one which is the actual little text blurb that they put in front of every book to kind of like set the tone of it. So the shitty meme version requires me to knock back half a bottle of vodka, then half a bunch of paint fumes, and then slur the words at you. So this all started when the space Egyptian cancer patients declared war on the toad gods, and it was all just downhill from there. That is true. I'll get to that in a bit, but that is kind of like the prologue to the prologue to the prologue to the prologue to the prologue. We're talking like millennia before humanity even existed. Because the thing is, Warhammer 40K is a post-apocalyptic setting, but it's like on its fifth apocalypse by now. So like that's kind of like the jokey introduction, which is true, but also just mainly there for laughs. And then there's the quote that Games Workshop has decided this captures the atmosphere of what we're trying to tell here so like thoroughly that we're going to put it in every single book. This might take me a minute. It's a little bit on the long side, but there is just no way to do the setting justice without it. It is the 41st millennium. For more than 100 centuries, the Emperor has sat immobile on the golden throne of terror. He is the master of mankind by the will of the gods, and master of 1,000,000 worlds by the might of his inexhaustible armies. He is a rotting carcass, writhing invisibly with power from the dark age of technology. He is the carrion lord of the Imperium, for whom 1,000 souls are sacrificed every day, so that he may never truly die. Yet even in his deathless state, the Emperor continues his eternal vigilance. Mighty battle fleets cross the demon-infested miasma of the warp, the only route between distant stars, the way lit by the Astronomicon, the psychic manifestation of the Emperor's will. Vast armies give battle in his name on uncounted worlds. Greatest among his soldiers are the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines, his bio-engineered super warriors. Their comrades in arms are legion, the Imperial Guard and countless planetary defense forces, the ever-vigilant Inquisition, and the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, to name only a few. But for all their multitudes, they are barely enough to hold off the ever-present threat from aliens, heretics, mutants, and wars. To be a man in such time is to be one among untold billions. It is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. These are the tales of those times. Forget the power of technology and science, for so much has been forgotten, never to be relearned. Forget the promise of progress and understanding, for in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. There is no peace among the stars, only an eternity of carnage and slaughter, and the laughter of thirsting gods. So yeah, a very bright and sugary setting, as you can tell.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I think that's one of the keys, really. Like the one sentence bit that you see kind of memed as in the grim darkness of the future, there is only war, which has been memed to the point that people actually describe things as grim dark in a kind of mocking way.
They coined that. I mean, in a mocking way to an extent, but it's also used sincerely, and Games Workshop invented that. A little bit more context on the meta. This entire fantastic universe with, like, God knows how much lore built around it, was originally designed for the purpose of selling inordinately plastic little toy soldiers that you could glue together and paint yourself. It's since then completely spiraled out of control. There is God knows how many books. They only just a month ago or so finished writing up the prologue, which is 64 books, if I'm not mistaken. And that's the prologue. That's like 10,000 years before where we're currently at. There is like a bunch of games, most of them not great, a couple of absolute gems. There is audiobooks. There is Henry Cavill's working on an entire cinematic universe at the moment. There is so much to get into. But originally the purpose was to sell you little plastic army men, which is still the core part of the hobby.
Yeah, and I think, like, I have a suspicion that that's going to come, that fundamental, like, capitalist drive that we have to sell more toy soldiers is going to drive a lot of the other stuff about Warhammer 40k, because, like, fundamentally, in terms of, like, the philosophy of the world, you cannot ever allow a situation in which there could not be more, in which you could not have war, because you need to sell more toy soldiers, which means that no matter how vile any particular faction is, and they're all pretty vile, they're
all complete bastards.
You have to have a situation where they're going to continue being more and more vile, so that you can buy like 500 of these little guys and fight them against your friends' 500 of equally vile different guys.
Yeah, pretty much. You kind of saw that with one of the factions, the Tau Empire, which are like, imagine like anime Gundam mecha suits, portrayed as like the genuine good guys initially, and people hated them because why are there good guys in Warhammer? That's not what we're about here. So they started toning that down, and now there are very strong implications of a very rigid caste system being held up by mind control. And they're still easily, like, the least evil fuckers in the setting. Like, this is like, joining the Tau to fight the Imperium is like, there was a really good comparison. No, okay, sorry. The comparison wasn't with the Tau and the Imperium, but we're getting into factions, which let's park that for a minute.
We'll hold off on that. So, to having kind of set the scene of like a decaying corpse emperor sending out like genetically engineered super soldiers, in like the iconic thing about Warhammer 40k is probably like the Space Marine power armor. That's if you know nothing about the setting, but you've seen people do memes about horrible politicians and you've seen them like presented in like giant robot armor, that's a Warhammer 40k riff that those people are doing.
You have seen a Space Marine.
Yeah, no, you're guaranteed to have seen a Space Marine. Like, starting from there, how, I guess, how does all of this work? What I'm asking, I guess, is like, can you explain in the most general terms how the Empire gets there and what is going on?
Right. I'm gonna do my best. You may have to tell me when I go off on tangents, because, like I said, like, this has been something that has been built by companies worth of people since I think the 1980s, top of my head.
And it's like, it's kind of an exercise in, I suspect if you could dig into these people's backgrounds and like know the innermost thoughts of all of them, it's kind of an exercise in weaponizing autism. Like, what happens, I suspect, is someone comes up with something off the seat of their pants, and then another person who has that kind of brain goes, I'm going to give you a 70 million year history of how that thing that you thought of spitballing fits into everything else. For everything, there is that amount of detail.
Absolutely. So in the very, very, very basic gist of how everything works, so the first thing to know is that Warhammer, it's technically 40k. I'm going to call it Warhammer and 40k interchangeably because we're not talking about fantasy tonight, even though it is my favorite. But 40k is the topic. So,
but, I mean, there's also some shared stuff between them in terms of like
there's some
philosophy
overlap.
and metaphysics and things.
Yeah, pretty much. But we'll limit how much we'll talk about that. The main overlap is what I'm going to be talking about now, which is the Warp, the realm of chaos, which is like hell, basically. It used to not be hell, but because what happens, it's like this separate dimension from our material reality that basically contains all the emotions and thoughts and feelings of sapient people. And if there's enough of a shared emotion, it eventually just like takes shape and becomes sentient. And if it's like shared by like a massive amount of people, like we're talking a galaxy's worth, it's going to become a god. So way back when, it was a very chill area. But then the aforementioned fight between the space Egyptians and the Toad Gods happened, and quite literally the entire galaxy fell into a giant war. Which, that's going to have a lot of combat. So there came Khorne, the god of blood, slaughter, and chaos, who literally sits upon the throne of skulls. There was a lot of scheming and plotting and backstabbing, and everything changed all the time. There was Tsinch, the god of magic, chaos, and general bullshit. There was a lot of decay going on, a lot of disease and rot. Up came Nurgle, the god of pestilence. These guys took what was basically just a neutral reflection, kind of like a separate spiritual dimension, more or less, and they turned it into hell, just like straight up hell. Now we're gonna flash forward about like I think 50-ish thousand years, maybe more. We're gonna go to roughly 25,000 after Christ, roughly. That all happened. The Toad Gods, who are known as the Old Ones, made a bunch of species to help them fight the Necrons, which are the space Egyptians. By this point, they've become robot space Egyptians. Long story, you can play them, they're quite cool. 25,000, roughly, I'm spitballing top of my head. One of their successor species that the Old Ones created, the Eldar, which are just basically space elves, have claimed most of the galaxy and created a bit of a golden age. However, because they had this golden age, they started to fall into decadence and debauchery, especially because they could just reincarnate after every death. So they didn't really have that much to do. So their forms of entertainment got more interesting and more interesting and more interesting. And oops, now my rendition of Shakespeare is indistinguishable from just very gory murder on stage. Eventually, all of that excess created a fourth god / god of excess. Imagine the guys from Hellraiser if they became a god. And obviously, the birth of
I was going to say, very, very brief tangent, but I promise you it's quite funny. When I was in my early 20s, I had a summer job doing something called vine lifting, which is on a vineyard. There's these wires that lift the vines up and keep them in place. And every so often you pay people to go along and just yank them up and push the vines up a level. And you get paired with, like, you work in a buddy system because you need like two people to lift the wires up. I was paired with this younger guy. So I would have been like 20 and he would have been like 17 or something like that. And he told me while we were doing this work very earnestly about his Christian faith. He was one of the, at that point, the conflict about Harry Potter was that it was going to make your children into Satanists. He was one of those guys. But his like fun, wholesome hobby that he did so that he wasn't taught witchcraft by Harry Potter was that he was a 40K guy. And I knew enough about 40K to be like, oh, okay, that's interesting. What army do you play? And he was like, Eldar.
Okay.
Yeah, I hope she's very happy these days.
Fair enough. I mean, could have been worse. Could have been the Dark Eldar. But yeah, trying to get your kid to not become a Harry Potter Satanist by letting them play Warhammer is trying to prevent them from becoming a stoner by fostering a crack habit. Fair enough.
Anyway, sorry, you were talking about the Eldar giving rise to Slaanesh.
Yeah, the Eldar basically murder-shagged a new god into existence. Now, back in time a little bit, while the Elder were having this golden age, humanity was having. I might be getting my timeline mixed up, but also this is the prologue of the prologue of the prologue, so who cares? Humanity had spread across the stars, post-scarcity, full automation, AI does everything, standard utopia, kind of like Star Trek. But the problem was that we had, like, AI did everything for us. We were across the stars everywhere. AI did everything for us. We didn't really know that much anymore, because AI handled everything. So AI decided, what do we need these fucking meatbags for? So, standard sci-fi trope, you have the AI uprising. Humanity wins this, barely, by the skin of their teeth. And obviously, you're fighting the guy that has all your knowledge. You're going to be destroying a lot of your knowledge. So, humanity this is why they call it the Dark Age of Technology, because it was a golden age until suddenly it wasn't. So we just barely defeat the AI uprising. At that point, psychers start popping up. Now, psychers are basically space wizards. The way they do space wizardry is by opening their mind to the warp, the hell dimension that we just talked about. Now, that lets them do cool stuff like sending telepathic messages across time and space, or throw fireballs at people you don't like. The downside of this is that you're opening your brain to hell. So a lot of demons started popping up, a lot of possessions everywhere. The only planets that survived that were the ones that viciously and brutally murdered all witches on sight, which isn't really the foundation for, a progressive, tolerant society. So while that was going on, and the amount of psychers popping up got worse and worse as Slaanesh got closer to being birthed, eventually all of that coalesced into the warp becoming so roiling and chaotic with the almost birth of a god, that faster than light travel became impossible. Because here's the funny thing about faster than light travel in Warhammer: you do it by ripping a hole in reality and taking a walk across Satan's front lawn as a shortcut. So at the best of times, you kind of need to already kind of throw a cardboard box over yourself to hide. And even then, if you get noticed, Satan's probably going to sick his dogs on you. If there is currently an active pub brawl going on that front lawn, you're not getting through it. You're gonna get bottled, man. So faster than light travel became impossible, and whatever human empire or Star Trek Federation or whatever was there before all of this, it just completely collapsed. Everything became just the world you were on. Maybe if you're lucky, the next solar system over, but that was it. So humanity completely just collapsed in on itself. Barely any tech, no centralized authority to speak of. Everyone isolated. And at that point, Slaanesh, the Hellraiser god, pops into existence, which destroyed the entire Eldar Empire to the point where the only guys that are currently still alive are the ones that decided to say, screw this, we're seeing which way the wind is blowing, and just hopped on a giant planet-sized spaceship and got to the other end of the universe first. Or galaxy, rather. And also a couple very evil Hellraiser pirates hiding out in Hell, but long story. So eventually, we've come back to Earth, which has, at this point, completely collapsed into techno-barbarianism, as has most of the rest of the universe. And here we find perhaps the man with the most main character energy in any fictional setting ever, the Emperor. We don't know what gold deposit he crawled out of, but the implication is that he's been around since humanity has been, more or less. And the Emperor is one of those, he very much cares about humanity as a whole. He wants to see it flourish. He could give a shit about individual humans. So what he starts doing is, okay, the Chaos Gods are messing with us. Aliens and Xenos are preying on the humans everywhere because, our Empire collapsed, we can't fight them off anymore. I need to unite all humans under my banner. So he starts, I could call it gene enhancing. Well, I'm not sure if it's eugenics, actually, because he's not necessarily trying to do any breeding. I think we can go with gene enhancing. He starts bioengineering super soldiers to help him first conquer Earth. Then the ones that he created, that was kind of like a hothouse situation that he threw together to quickly conquer Earth. Those guys were far too unstable. He put them down with his next generation of bioengineered super rare soldiers. That's the Space Marines. Or, well, this was the Custodes technically, but whatever. He eventually looks out at the state of the universe and goes, there's a lot of that I need to conquer. And I'm pretty great, but it can only be in one place at once. I'm going to need more of me to do this. So what he then does is he creates 20 Primarchs, basically his sons, like sons from a lab, because the Emperor just loves his bioengineering. And these guys aren't quite on the level of the Emperor, but they're still like leagues and bounds above mere mortals. He creates 20 of them. And the Chaos Gods look at this and go like, this guy's trying to undermine everything we're trying to do. He's stomping out religions everywhere because he thinks religions feed us, which is true, but not the whole story. We should probably mess with him before he can actually undermine us too much. So they scoop up these 20 bioengineered demigods, basically, and just chuck them all across the galaxy. 2 of these, at some point, were irrevocably just unpersoned, erased from history by the Imperium. We don't know what happened to them, so I'll just be talking about the 18 that are left. We have the remaining 80. The Emperor looks at this, goes, I needed those guys. I'm going to have to go get them back. So he starts his great crusade, his plan to unify humanity, way ahead of schedule, because he needs to get his demigods back. This results in him eventually reuniting with all of them, and I'm kind of keeping an eye on the time, so I'm just going to go through this super quickly. Eventually, Chaos didn't just scatter them all across the planet. Over the course of their life, over the universe, over the course of their lifetimes, it managed to sink its teeth into them, fully half of them, including the greatest, the Emperor's favorite, Horus, who you may know as the man the Horus heresy is named after. And fully 9 of the 18 Primarchs, along with their Space Marine legions, turn on the Emperor in the most devastating civil war, not ever in Warhammer, but it's up there, probably top 5, if not top 3. This civil war is so devastating that 10,000 years later, the Imperium of Man still hasn't recovered. Horus almost killed the Emperor to the point where he basically killed him. The Emperor is just being kept alive by the golden throne that they put him on, which has functionally turned him into a lighthouse to be able to travel through the warp more safely, at the cost of having to feed him 1,000 psychers every single day. So, long story short, your life sucks. Everything is bloody miserable. The Imperium of Men now goes against everything that the Emperor wanted it to be, by which I mean it went from a fascist warlord state run by r/atheism into a fascist warlord state that's also deeply theocratic. Your life sucks. Everything is awful. If you look at the wrong guy funny, you're going to be lobotomized and turned into a mindless cyborg servitor because AI is now banned. You're probably going to get eaten by space bugs, and if you don't, you're probably going to get sacrificed to summon a demon. And that is like a very, very brief, kind of chaotic summary of the setting as a whole.
Excellent. That is very useful for the direction that we're going to go in a second. You were looking at the time. It is time for us to take a brief break. So we will be back to continue this conversation right after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
You're listening to Reserved Recommendations. This is a radio show and podcast about great trash and problematic faves. It is produced by Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irarangi o ngā Tangata o Manawatu, with the support of New Zealand On Air. So cheers for that, guys. This episode, I am talking to Mira all the way from the Netherlands about the massive and it's turning out to be like deeply unwieldy thing to talk about, which is Warhammer 40k. Thank you very much for the rundown on the setting. I think that's a useful place to start, because one of the things that makes Warhammer 40k in particular like a reserved thing to recommend is that a lot of the ways in which the world is awful makes the setting deeply appealing to fascists, which is like, there are lots of hobbies which have a fascism problem, but Warhammer 40k, I think, because one of the things Games Workshop is really good at is coming up with like really striking images or really great, if like shallow formulations for political or theological slogans, is that their stuff gets memed out by fascists in a way that's kind of unique. Like, as a person who does this for fun, is this like a thing that you have to encounter, or is this a thing that's like inflated for me as an internet person?
No, you're definitely spot on. I have to say I've been lucky enough that I've not run into them much, but that's also because Warhammer is like 5 different hobbies in a trench coat. My hobbies are mainly the knowing far too much about the lore and setting side, and the painting miniature side. I don't really do the gaming, so I don't have to like encounter that many people from the scene. But Warhammer 40k especially does have a massive fascism problem. Although credit where it's due to Games Workshop, they actively have said, if you are a hateful piece of shit, we don't want your money, go away. That was in response to a guy rocking up to a tournament in Spain, I believe, wearing actual, like, I'm not sure if he was wearing neo-Nazi memorabilia or if he painted his army that way, but anyway, it was definitely not okay. They couldn't technically ban him, so Games Workshop, in response to that, put out a massive statement going like, hey, the Imperium is a hate-filled sack of shit place. We are not, and we don't want that in the real world. If you're like that, we don't want you here. We don't want you in our hobby. We don't want your money. Go away. And for Games Workshop to tell you they don't want your money is kind of unheard of. So they have been trying, but the problem is, like you kind of said already, Games Workshop is really, really, really good at aesthetics of power and tyranny and autocracy, and fascism is nothing but aesthetics, if we're being real. It's all about the aesthetics of power, which is what the setting is quite literally built on.
Do you put much credence, because I've seen people kind of argue both sides of this, do you put much credence in the idea that the Imperium in particular was intended in some ways as like satire? Because Games Workshop does have its roots in the UK in the 80s, which is, a notoriously grim and dark time for that country. Thatcher. I was a kid in Scotland from like 1986 through to 1993, 1994, something like that. And I remember, like, I wasn't engaged because I was like 8, but like seeing anti-Thatcher graffiti everywhere, because Glasgow in particular, had its industries gutted and everyone was just furious permanently.
Yeah. Absolutely, 110%. I honestly don't think there is much of an argument that it wasn't, and still isn't to some degree today. Because I did actually go out of my way to look up what the original creators of Warhammer said about this, and a quote from Rick Priestley, one of the 3 original creators of this setting. To me, the background of 40k was always intended to be ironic. The fact that the Space Marines were lauded as heroes within Games Workshop always amused me, because they're brutal, they're also completely self-deceiving. The whole idea of the Emperor is that you don't know whether he's alive or dead. The Imperium may be running on superstition. There's no guarantee that the Emperor is anything other than a corpse with residual mental ability to direct spacecraft. It's got some parallels with religious beliefs and principles, and I think a lot of that got missed and overwritten. 40k at its core was always a critique and a satire of what Britain was at the time. Most concrete example of that, or well, maybe not most concrete, but most obvious one example of that would be the orcs. Sentient space fungi that are quite literally a direct parody of British football hooligan culture, to the point that they all talk with a Cockney accent.
The thing that I love about the orcs is that they're like, the other thing that I think Games Workshop does really well, that is really compelling, is their, like, you know, the saying, good artists imitate, great artists steal. Yeah, they are some of the most gifted thieves in terms of like cool bits of sci-fi ephemera that I have ever encountered. Like lots of fantasy and space fantasy stuff takes orcs more or less directly from Tolkien via Dungeons and Dragons. But what Games Workshop did with them, which was to like take them, decide that they're mushrooms, and then give them like, because they're not just soccer hooligans. The way in which they're soccer hooligans is almost kind of like Terry Pratchett-y. Like the thing about orcs that I remember is that all of their technology is junk in the hands of any other sentient species. All of the stuff they have only works because orcs think that it ought to. And like, therefore, all of its functional changes are essentially to make it look more like they feel like it should.
Absolutely. Orcs do have the reality-bending Gestalt field, which only works because they're quite literally too stupid to realize it shouldn't. And again, like I said at the beginning, there's two versions of this. There's a funny meme version and a serious version. The serious version is, and this is quote-unquote serious because we're talking about the orcs, that they will make a plane that does not have an engine in it, because it's got the propeller and it's got the wings, and that's what a plane like flies with, because that's what you can see a plane having when it flies. And it doesn't have steering wheel either. It just has a button that says go. And it just works as a plane, because hey, it can fly and it can go, and that's all you need. And then there's the shitty meme version, which is where if you give an orc a stick and you convince him it's a gun, he'll blow your head off with it. It doesn't go quite that far, but I choose to leave it anyway because it's funny. But yeah, like you said, Games Workshop. Sorry, you?
I was going to say, like, that's an example, but when we were having sort of preliminary discussions about how things work and all that sort of stuff, like you mentioned, and I hadn't really thought about it, but you're exactly right. Like a lot of the stuff about the kind of amoral space imperium is ripped off pretty solidly from Dune. The chaos is ripped off from Michael Moorcock via Dungeons and Dragons. Like just such a kind of pastiche of stuff that was available in the 80s as sci-fi and fantasy.
Good bit of Starship Troopers in there as well. I will say though, my main exposure to sci-fi and science fantasy has been 40k. I only recently read the first Dune book, and my girlfriend's only now getting me into Star Trek. So for me, it's kind of difficult to spot those parallels at times. But if you want a blatantly obvious example of how ridiculously good Games Workshop is at stealing, take a look at the world map from Warhammer Fantasy. It's quite literally just like our Earth's map, but like with the homework changed a little bit so the teacher doesn't notice. Oh, and they smacked Atlantis in there, but Games Workshop is the master at just like taking something and then putting a little interesting twist on it, and then just throwing it into a setting that has so much other stolen shit in it that it just starts interacting in really unique and interesting ways.
So can I ask, this is like a slight swerve, but like for your collecting and painting, do you have a particular favorite?
Honestly, I kind of just collect what strikes my fancy, because I'm not really playing. I don't really have to concern myself with building functioning armies. Currently, I've been catching up with some old fantasy miniatures that I had still had lying around. But in terms of 40k, I got myself a box of Adeptus Mechanicus Skitarii, which imagine kind of like the vibe of a Christian monastery combined with Tibetan monks, combined with like engineers. They quite literally worship technology in a really interesting way, because they basically operate on the principle of every bit of knowledge out there has already been invented, and we lost it in the dark age of technology when the robots rose up against us. It is our sacred duty to the machine god to go out there and find it. So on the one hand, they really, really, really are pro-technology because they want to find all the old tech. On the other hand, they're extremely anti-innovation, because think about it. Every technology that ever exists has already been made. So if you're going to walk up to me and you're going to say you invented a new thing, you're a bloody heretic, and I'm going to blow your head off for that. It's a really interesting dynamic, I think.
Yeah, no, that is yeah, I can get. I think this is the key thing. I can get the vibe, and the vibe sounds fun. The thing that I experienced again and again when I was playing a lot of World of Darkness stuff was that for any given faction or kind of supernatural greebly that you can play, because the original core World of Darkness, incidentally, if you would like to hear me talk a lot about that, there is a past episode, this is kind of directed to the listener, that you can find on YouTube where I talk to my brother about the World of Darkness for far too long.
But, yeah, I got my friends into a V5 Vampire the Masquerade game over last year. So much fun, but carry on.
My point was that, like, for all of those, you can get deeply into the lore. You know, particularly the original World of Darkness has this millennia-spanning metaplot and things. But you can also just immediately go, oh, right, I have the vibe of that. That works for me. And that that split is interesting. It's also like I fall very, very hard on the vibes thing. Like I had a recurring experience of like borrowing other people's World of Darkness faction books and finding that there was like 2 sentences that gave me a really interesting new perspective, and the rest of it was just like I don't need to know like your official fan fiction about characters that you've made up.
Entirely fair.
Where I was going with this was that, do you feel like, I have an intuition that, and I'm curious as to whether you agree with it, that one of the things that I guess is intention in Warhammer 40k is the original kind of satires of particular social movements or styles of government, or I guess attitudes to war and power, relative to the autistic impulse to generate millennia of lore for everything. Like, because my intuition is that it's quite easy to get the Corpse Emperor and put him next to Margaret Thatcher just as an image. But then when you give him his entire life story, suddenly it becomes a different thing.
To an extent, I get where you're coming from, but at the same time, yes, to an extent, because the original setting was, at its core, a joke rooted very much in the social politics of Britain of the 80s. And as we've kind of like aged out of that in terms of like the new writers coming in, some of them still get the joke and are really good at it. For example, Graham McNeil, one of the authors that's written a lot for the Games Workshop Horus Heresy series, which is the prologue to the entire setting, basically. From what I've read of his work so far, he gets the joke. Concrete example, 2 Space Marines are on an alien planet. One is going to turn heretic when Horus Heresy happens, the other remains loyal. The heretic one is the one that picks up a dead alien's arm and starts using it as a weapon, while we can read the thoughts of the loyalist one, and he just goes on like the most xenophobic, rant that I've ever read. Like, this would make like a Victorian phrenologist blush, and he's like the POV character for that series. Some of them get the joke and know that the Imperium is supposed to be horrific. They quite literally lobotomize babies to use them to carry ammunition. They're assholes. Screw them. Some writers still get that joke. Others, because the original context is at this point, I think, like 40 years ago or something, don't really get the joke anymore. Or marketing department is like, we need to portray these guys in a heroic light so we can sell more miniatures. Some may not get the joke as much, and I gotta be honest, I started on the Horus Heresy. There's like 64 books. I'm on like book 2. And that's just the prologues. There are so many other good books out there. I can probably throw a couple recommendations in at the end based on what other people told me, but there's just so much stuff. Like, I don't know all of it. I can't tell you the full extent, but there is some risk of losing the joke there. On the other hand, there are still people who get it, and you can't really get around that little bit in the opening blurb that was the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. On some level, no matter how much you're trying to polish the bloody viscera that have been rotting for 10,000 millennia, you're not going to make it look like the good guys.
Fair enough. Well, we are coming up close to time, and there are a couple of things that I like to do by way of wrapping up. The first is to ask you, for those recommendations that you were just talking about, like, are there good ways into the enormous and dense 40k lore for people who are interested? Are there non-40k things that scratch a similar itch that you would recommend?
Good question. In terms of getting into 40k, like I said, it's 5 different hobbies in the trenchcoat. If you want to get into it through the books, I've personally very much enjoyed the Commissar Kane novels. They're a bit more of like a lighthearted take on perhaps one of the Imperium's darkest professions, while also just being kind of funny because the protagonist just has massive imposter syndrome. There's also the Inquisitor Eisenhorn books, which is more of a James Bond vibe, I've been told. And there's also the Infinite and the Divine, which is about those space robots I mentioned earlier. 2 of them just being in an intensely petty old man fight for like 10,000 years. In terms of video games, there is Dawn of War, which is one of the better Warhammer games and a pretty solid RTS as well. There's also Darktide, which is a quite fun co-op shooter. In terms of getting into the lore, I eat, live, and breathe Warhammer lore podcasters and YouTubers, because there are plenty of people who make a full-time job out of just understanding this and telling it to people. And after this, I have a lot more respect for them, because, oh boy, is it difficult to do this setting justice. Like, I did not do this justice. Like, this was a mess. Listen to the guys who know what they're doing. In terms of getting into it, Adeptus Ridiculous is a good starting point, because the entire premise of that podcast is taking a guy who's been in the Warhammer lore trenches since being a teenager, and just like taking his poor friend who doesn't know what he signed up for and just telling him what it's about. So it's a really interesting dynamic, and if you watch it in order, you also get the experience of like learning along with the guy that doesn't know what Warhammer is. Once you've gotten your footing, I quite like Oculus Imperia, which is lore told from an in-universe perspective, which makes it really interesting. And to close that one off, make it a holy trinity, why not? I've currently really been on an, let me get the name right real quick, because I think it was Isyander, but it might have been Iskander. Let me check. Isyander Encoda, which is kind of the same vibe as Adeptus Ridiculous, in taking a guy that doesn't know much and a guy who's very into it and explaining it to the other guy. But in a more low-key, less memey way, more or less. Those are all good starting points, and feel free to hit me up on Blue Sky. I'll gladly talk your ear off about this for like hours.
Excellent. Well, this segues beautifully into the final thing, which is like, do you have stuff to plug? Obviously, people can find you as Sea Shanty Stan on Blue Sky. I would recommend Mira as a follow, because there's a beautiful blend of like an interesting social perspective from the Netherlands and also Warhammer 40k and fantasy lore and various other wonderful stuff that, it's a privilege to have that kind of thing show up in your timeline and improve your day. It's wonderful.
Oh, thank you. That's really sweet. I appreciate that a lot. In terms of stuff to plug, on Blue Sky, I'm anarchoshanties.bluesky.social. Beyond that, I've made like 2 games that you can find on itch. Let me see, I think that was Omnicide 101, which you can find by going to omnicide101.itch.io. There's like 2, they're very simple, but I'm quite proud of them. Beyond that, I am actually looking into maybe starting a Warhammer podcast with a friend of mine, where the idea is that we're going to take people that know quite a bit about Warhammer 40k, and we're going to go, if you like this thing about 40k, you might like this about Warhammer Fantasy, because they share the same themes. That one might maybe be more interesting to Warhammer fans than to people who aren't necessarily super deep into it. But then again, the target audience for any podcast or video about explaining Warhammer to non-Warhammer people is not non-Warhammer people, it's Warhammer people that are living vicariously through someone who gets to just inflict Warhammer lore on someone else.
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show was produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. If you enjoyed this show, why not go ahead and share it with a friend? You can find the last 10 episodes at npr.nz/show/reserved, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want an episode older than that, try searching for Reserved Recommendations on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter at Objective Realty, or you can follow the show on Facebook. And finally, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit community access station. If you like this or any other piece of their fine audio programming, why not fling them $1 or $2? You can go to npr.nz/donate for more information on how to do that.